Good day, comrades. I am Jim, and today on our Year 1 reading plan episode, we are going to talk about Karl Marx and Frederick Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. Next up on Great Books, Big Ideas. So I think Karl Marx needs no introduction. I'm not going to go into a bio of him right now, but I do want to give you a short background about the publication of the Communist Manifesto. There's a short introduction in this translation by Frederick Engels. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848 as the political platform of the Communist League, which began in Germany and then spread internationally to other countries. The manifesto is very short, one of the shortest works that we've read in this Year 1 plan, and it is a political tract. You could see it as propaganda. It's a statement of purpose with a very messianic message about almost the historical inevitability of communist revolution to take over from the bourgeois class that rules things right now. The work was largely written by Marx, and Engels fully admits that in his introduction. And on page 416 of the introduction, Engels says, "This is the nucleus of the work that Marx came up with, and it's a proposition. Tell me what you think of this proposition." I'm going to quote it. "The proposition is that in every historical epoch, the prevailing mode of economic production and exchange and the social organization necessarily following from it form the basis upon which is built up and from which alone can be explained the political and intellectual history of that epoch. That consequently, the whole history of mankind, since the dissolution of primitive tribal society holding land and common ownership, has been a history of class struggles, contests between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes, that the history of these class struggles forms a series of evolutions in which nowadays a stage has been reached where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot attain its emancipation from the sway of the exploiting and ruling class, the bourgeoisie, without at the same time and once and for all emancipating society at large from all exploitation, oppression, class distinctions, and class struggles." That, in a nutshell, is what the Communist Manifesto is all about. It's kind of like this historical materialism, basically, is what this theory is. And also that this base superstructure construct where the economic relations of society are at the base, and then a superstructure of intellectual ideas and laws and culture are built on top of that, or they kind of grow out of that base. Now, these are very influential ideas, and they're also contentious, and not everyone agrees with them. The work is segmented into 4 chapters. Really, the first 2, I think, are the most important. It starts with a prologue, and I'll quote some of this for you. Actually, I might quote the whole thing because it's short. "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. They're all ganging up against the communists. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? 2 things result from this fact. Communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. And let me stop there. Communism in these early days, around 1848, it isn't even really a thing quite yet. It's just getting started, and yet the powers that be in Europe, they already know what a threat it is. Like they're almost like there before the political formation has coalesced. And what Marx is trying to do here in this document is to do the coalescing, right, and form a party around this. So that's the first thing that results from this fact. The second is, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. So that's the statement of purpose. Chapter 1 is called Bourgeois and Proletarians. And I want to refer to the footnote here, which defines what Marx and Engels mean by those social classes. By bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production, and employers of wage labor. Okay, that's the bourgeoisie, the class who owns the means of social production and the employers. By proletariat, they mean the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. Which class do you belong to, according to that split? So we open up with the proposition that Engels mentioned in his intro, that all history is the history of class struggle. Bit of a controversial point, but that's what they say. They say the bourgeoisie has ascended to class dominance. They are the dominant class right now for about 100 years, but this has not done away with class antagonism. The class struggle continues, it persists. What the bourgeoisie has done is it has simplified those class antagonisms, and Marx talks a lot about it. It's kind of reduced now to the employers and the employed, the owners and the workers, two classes. So it's consolidating, it's simplified, reduced to this sort of mano-a-mano battle. All right, so on page 420 of the text, he talks about how the bourgeoisie is the product of a long course of development, and in its rise to power, the bourgeoisie has played a very revolutionary role. It's a revolutionary class. And let me quote him on page 420. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left no other bond between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. You can hear in Marx's language there the moral fervor. It's almost like a Jeremiah. He's like really giving it to them there. Let's continue. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental will and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. It's all about money. It's all about exchange value. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former migrations of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts in air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. That's some powerful writing, no matter what you think of it. The rhetoric is pretty on point. This all that is solid melts in air. It's really about the creative destruction that is capitalism. You know, it constantly revolutionizes things, but also destroys along the way. And anything that's traditional is swept away or torn asunder. Then he gets into the cosmopolitan character of the bourgeoisie, which has eroded national loyalties and identities. And it definitely privileges the town over the country. And it has made barbarian countries, those are his words, dependent on civilized countries. I'm thinking here of colonialism and imperialism. It has centralized the means of production, and it has centralized property in the hands of a few, and this has resulted in political centralization. But capitalism has engineered the most massive productive forces in human history. You may be surprised at how much Marx praises capitalism in some of these regards. But the capitalist is out of control. And I want to quote the little passage on page 422. He says, modern bourgeois society with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. I can't help but think of the sorcerer's apprentice. It's like the bull in the china shop. You know, capitalism is just out of control. So as he continues in this chapter, he talks a lot about the formation of the working class. He traces that. And he also talks on page 422 about some of the results of this development. Well, you get these masses of industrialized armies, the proletariat. You also, women and children enter the workforce and begin to compete with the men for jobs. And then workers are beset by landlords and shopkeepers and pawnbrokers. And then you also find that the lower middle classes, like the shopkeeper class, if you will, they are sinking into the proletariat. That's the tendency, because they get outclassed by the bourgeoisie. But there's an interesting little quote here about the alienation effect that results from the division of labor and this massing of productive forces. This is stuff that is, we've seen some of this before in Adam Smith, but now Marx is going to put his own stamp on it. He says on page 422, owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. Work is just work. There's no pride in it anymore. You're not a craftsman like you might have been in the Middle Ages. You're not a jack of all trades who can sort of do all kinds of things. You're the specialized cog in the machine. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. So he's really noticing like what this system does to the worker. And I imagine that proletarians who were reading the Communist Manifesto would probably relate to it. I think a lot of us can relate to that when we think about schlepping off to work every day. So the result of this development of the working class, the proletarians, they are becoming a mass movement, and they will be the revolutionary class. The lower middle classes, on the other hand, they are more reactionary. They're conservative. They want to cling to what they have. They're sort of caught between the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. So where does this leave the proletarians? Well, they don't have any property. Their relation to their wives and children are no longer anything in common with bourgeois family relations. They're stripped of every trace of national character. And things like the law, the morality, the religion of the society are so many bourgeois prejudices, in Marx's words. And they are there to ambush the proletarians. So yeah, it's kind of a mess. Okay, let's move on to chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. Really what he's doing here is he's kind of distinguishing between like the masses and the Communist Party or people of that political persuasion. And he says that the communists have a more internationalist bent, and they represent the movement as a whole. They're like the self-appointed representatives of the proletarians. They see themselves as the vanguard party. I can't help but think of the Bolshevists here in Russia. They probably would call themselves the vanguard. And then in this chapter, he takes up many bourgeois objections to communism. Some of so this gets back to the specter, like the spook factor, like, ooh, the communists are like so dangerous and risky. What are they going to do to us if they take power? And the first is abolition of property. And I'm going to quote a little bit from page 425 into 426. And he says, the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property, generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. And that's what we want to get rid of. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has, to a great extent, already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. What about the abolition of individuality and freedom? He gets this on the second column of page 426. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. He comes out and says it. Let me keep going. Marx is on a roll. You are horrified. Notice how he's like now using the second person pronoun, like he's addressing the bourgeoisie. Because he's facing up the counter arguments here. So he's giving it back. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of the 9/10. In a word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. We're taking it away from you. And then jumping down to the bottom of the page, he starts to sum up this little part of the argument. He says, communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. It deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. And then he takes up the objection that, won't culture disappear under a communist system? And he says, just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. You see how class conscious he is? Like, the bourgeois class has their whole host of ideas that are there to support the means and the relations of production. And he says, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of existence of your class. He keeps coming back to that proposition. And he calls this a selfish misconception. For Marx, laws, ideas, culture, it's all historical. It all goes back to class struggle. But the bourgeois doesn't recognize that they're like all the other ruling classes that preceded them in history. He also counters the notion of the abolition of the family, that communism will abolish the family, saying, capitalism's already doing a good job of that. Thank you very much. The same with the fear that it'll destroy marriage and there'll be communities of women, I guess open marriages and that kind of thing. And he beats down that idea. He also takes on the accusation that nations will be abolished. And again, he's sort of saying capitalism is already doing these kinds of things to the people. I also want to quote from page 428b a point he makes about the history of ideas, which I think is somewhat controversial. He says this, I'm quoting again, the charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? He keeps hammering this point home. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Just jumping down a little farther. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religion, moral, philosophical, and juridical law ideas have been modified in the course of historical development. But religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. You follow? Like, okay, he's sort of positing a responder who says, yeah, okay, there is historical development of these ideas. There is a history of ideas, but there is a kind of a continuity there that survives this change. There are, besides, eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., big ideas, shall we call them, that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. And now Marx rebuts. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder then that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. And then he finishes this chapter really with a 10-step political platform. So I'm going to read these for you. Tell me what you think of these and whether you see, this was written in 1848. So since that time, have any of these been implemented in your society? Number 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Number 2, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. Number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. That's emigrants and rebels. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8, equal obligation of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of child factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc. That's the communist program. And then he talks at the end of that chapter a little bit about how eventually the state will wither away. He doesn't use those words, but that's my understanding of it. And it gets a little utopian here, idealistic at the end. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And then chapter 3, which I won't spend much time on 3 and 4, but this is about the fine distinctions between different left-wing movements or parties, and namely revolutionary socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, critical utopian socialism, and communism. We won't cover this much, like I said, but if you read this chapter, you might think a little bit about the spectrum of left-wing thinking, and also about how people on the left just don't get along with each other at all. They're like constantly subdividing into factions. It's pretty absurd. But and you can also understand why the Democratic Party in the United States, maybe the Labour Party in the UK, these are far cries from communism. And then chapter 4 is about the position of the communists in relation to the opposing parties. It ends with a very famous quotation that's meant to rile up the worker troops, he says, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. So you can say, like, Marx is really trying to be the revolutionary here, isn't he? And this scares a lot of people, let's face it. So let me give you some discussion questions. There's a lot you can talk about with this text, and these are just a few topics that came to mind. One would be just to think about, intervening history. Why has the communist revolution predicted by the Manifesto really not come true? He thought, I think, he was onto something and that this would maybe happen pretty quickly, but it hasn't really. I don't know. Last I checked, I don't see many communist nations that are in the West, especially, that have successfully pulled this off. Another question, does communist revolution necessarily lead to totalitarianism? You can make that argument if you study the history of the 20th century, especially in places like Russia, and also to a large extent communist China. Although China is an interesting case because they seem to have been made this kind of transition. They're still ruled by a communist party, and yet they are a very strong economy that operates within the capitalist system. I don't fully understand that at all. Here's another one. Which steps in the communist platform relate to policies that have been adopted by democratic socialist and social democratic welfare states? You could see some of those platform planks that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that some of that stuff has happened, or it's happened to some degree, and it's coming by way of different reforms. So it's something to think about. Thinking now about some of these propositions that Marx has, is Marx right about history being the history of class struggle? Are there other views of history that he leaves aside? Is Marx right about the base superstructure model, where the economic relations of society determine the culture and ideas of society, the intellectual apparatus and the juridical apparatus and the moral and religious and ideological apparatus that sort of props everything up? Has the influence of this idea been to the benefit or detriment to society? I would argue, I'm not going to weigh in on that exactly, but I would argue that it has been very influential, at least in the West. Marx had, he has big ideas, like him or not. He's got big ideas, and they have wielded an influence, and this is one of them. And finally, are there really no eternal truths? Is there no continuity of great ideas? Marx seems to be maybe oversimplifying for the sake of his polemical argument. He doesn't back down from an intellectual fight, and he basically, there was one thing that I quoted where you could say, like, well, maybe he's giving a nod to continuity, but he seems more on the side of, once we have a revolution, then the ideas will change. So there is really no stability, not much continuity, very little continuity of ideas across the ages. And that's something I'm not so sure I agree with him on, but definitely some food for thought. Anyway, what do you think of the Communist Manifesto? And I'm sure we're going to get reactions. Next up on the Great Ideas reading program, Great Books reading program. We're nearing the end of year one. Next up is a play by Heinrich Ibsen, the great Norwegian playwright, one of my all-time favorite playwrights, and that is The Master Builder. And it's in the 1990 edition of the Great Books set. But it's also widely available, easy to find online. Many paperback editions exist of this play. And we'll talk about that next time on this playlist. Thanks for sharing this time with me, and I hope you're all well. Peace out.